most people, I assume, are not experiencing sexual attraction 24 hours a day. So just maybe think about a time you're going through the world not experiencing sexual attraction, and it's kind of like that most of the time. It's not some kind of unusual experience.
Welcome to Sleeping Around, where we offer a peek behind the curtain of modern sex and relationship therapy and research, bringing you insights and conversations otherwise reserved for the therapy room. I'm your host, Alayna Joy, a Master's of Counseling Psychology student, content creator, and lifelong sex and relationship nerd. Enjoy the episode. Hello everybody, welcome back to Sleeping Around. Today's episode has been highly requested. When I ask what episodes you want to see, asexuality and aromanticism and just the ace spectrum in general comes to the forefront. So I'm so excited to present to you Angela Chen. She is a journalist and the author of Ace, What Asexuality Reveals About Desire, Society, and the Meaning of Sex, which was named one of the best books of 2020 by NPR. Her reporting and essays have also appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, Paris Review, and more. I read this book last year, and as soon as I started this show, Angela was one of the first people I knew I wanted to reach out to, because not only does her expertise on asexuality shine in the book, but her journalism background really showed in that the book speaks to a larger audience than just those who might identify on the ace spectrum. She talks about desire and the meaning of sex to society as a whole. So whether you are ace or not, aka allo, I think there's a lot to learn from this book, and I hope that you enjoyed the episode. We talk about what asexuality is and isn't. We ask the question, how do you know if you're asexual? We talk about asexuality and sex. So many great pieces in this episode. So without further ado, enjoy. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I am honestly overjoyed to still be talking to people about the book, and very excited.
Okay, well, could you tell us a little bit about you, about your background, what led you to write the book?
Absolutely. So nowadays, I'm always joking that I have this double life because my career has, ever since the book, felt very split. So my entire career, I've been a journalist. I was a journalist before I realized I identified as ace. So I didn't, become a writer to write the book. And I've always been a science and tech person, still am. And then, after the book was published, people increasingly know me through that. So then I'll have people on both sides being, oh, wait, I didn't know you wrote this book. Or, oh, wait, I didn't know you actually mostly write about, technology and biomedicine.
Yep, that's the side I'm coming from.
Yeah, exactly. So it is kind of fun that there's actually not that much overlap between the two.
Right.
Yeah, but I think my background as a journalist really informed the decision to write the book. In my early 20s, I learned about asexuality and I realized that I identified as ace, and I started thinking that these ideas, this philosophy was helping me understand myself, but it was also helping me understand everyone else. I think it was helping me understand people who are allosexual, or, anyone who's not asexual is allosexual. And I wanted to have these discussions, but before I could have any deeper philosophical discussion, you'd have to do the one-on-one, like what is asexuality, blah, blah, blah. And I wanted to skip that. And because I was a journalist, I knew that I had the skills to do it, So it really, to me, seemed like it was something that helped my life and that I cared about. It was something that we didn't have a lot of, trade books on it. It was something that I knew how to write about because I'd always been a journalist. And all of those came together and gave me the idea to write the book. Though, to be honest, when I left my first job, I was at the Wall Street Journal, I was partly so I could write the book and, do a proposal for it. And I just immediately stopped working on it because I needed to freelance and make money. Writing a book proposal is not going to get you paid. So, it was actually a couple of years later, an agent reached out to me and he asked, do you have anything you're working on? And I said, a couple of years ago, I started working on this kind of half-baked idea. So it really has been, a long time since I started thinking about these topics.
So for everybody listening, back to basics, what is asexuality?
So the definition that you can, get if you Google online or whatnot, it's someone who doesn't experience sexual attraction, or maybe they don't experience it very strongly. I think that this can be very confusing because a lot of people don't really understand what asexuality, what that means. Like, what does it mean to not experience sexual attraction? Like, what does it mean to not have something? So I usually use a food metaphor. Let's use, pineapple pizza. Some people really love pineapple pizza and it's their favorite food. Some people really like it, but it's also possible, maybe you're indifferent to it. Like on your own, you're neither repulsed by it and you're also not really hungry for it, but maybe in certain circumstances you are interested in having it because it reminds you of college and what you used to do every Thursday night with your friends. So I think that is just one example of what it can mean to not experience sexual attraction. And that's one example of why it can be so complicated for people to figure out their ace. Backing up a little bit, what most people think asexuality means is that you don't want to have sex, you're not interested in sex. That's not necessarily true. There are people who are asexual and they're what we call sex repulsed. So, they're not interested in sex. There are people who are asexual and then they are kind of sex indifferent. And this is kind of what I mean by the pineapple pizza example. They're not the people who hate pineapple pizza. They don't have a craving for it, but maybe they genuinely enjoy it for other reasons. And then there are also people who are ace and are kind of, what we might call sex positive. So maybe they don't feel sexual attraction toward a specific person, but they might enjoy sex just because of the sensations. Can I say one more thing about kind of definitions? Yeah, so I know this can get kind of confusing. So one really key thing to understand is that there's this difference between libido, kind of sex drive, and attraction. So libido is just basically being horny. It's like, I feel horny, I want to have an orgasm, I want sexual release. And sexual attraction is that feeling toward a person. So you can just be horny by yourself in your room, no one is around, right? And I think it's totally possible to be a ace person. You feel that libido, but it's never directed toward anyone. So I think sometimes people will say, how is it possible to be a horny ace person? And that's kind of the answer.
Am I understanding right that libido is more of a physical experience, whereas sexual attraction is more of a mental experience, or am I missing something?
This is actually a very philosophical question because I think they can, like what is physical, what is mental? They're also connected. I think I would describe it more as kind of the direction, because sexual attraction can be a physical experience too. Maybe another way to explain it is for someone like me, I've never had the experience of being sexually attracted to strangers. Whereas some people, I've talked to many people, they do have the experience, they're walking down the street, they see someone and they just immediately feel that reaction toward them. And that's not something I've ever had, even though as an ace person, I do have sex and I do enjoy sex. So there's so many different nuances in these experiences.
I want to hear you say more about so many pieces of what you just said. But you touched on something that I got as a question from my audience in multiple different ways. When you were talking about the pineapple pizza metaphor, you mentioned it can be confusing to figure out that you're ace, because how do you figure out that you don't have something, right? Or that there's something you're not experiencing. And that was a question that I got was, how do I recognize sexual attraction as missing if I've never experienced it?
Yeah. So one of the ways I would answer this is to talk to other people and to talk to them in real detail. So I opened my book with this example of, many years ago, talking to a friend of mine. And then at the time, my friend was a virgin and I was not a virgin, but I was asking her, what does sexual attraction feel like? And it was not because I was having any quote unquote sexual problems in my relationship, but because of, various personal things, I was starting to wonder whether I was ace. And I think that was the first time in which someone actually gave me specific examples of what sexual attraction felt like for them. It wasn't just this vague thing like, oh, this person looked good to me. Like, people look good to me too, right? It wasn't just, I like them. I like people too. Like, I think she was very, and I love this friend, she was so honest about like, here's what it feels like in my body. Here's how I feel aroused. And these are conversations that I think many of us feel uncomfortable having even with our friends. And so we use this very vague and fuzzy language. And so many people are different. It's not like all ace experience is the same, but it's also not like all allosexual experience is the same either. So I've had these conversations with lots of people. My boyfriend is not ace. And, I've asked him what it feels like for him. And sometimes my questions are very, very nitpicky. My questions will be something like, okay, so you see an attractive person on the street and you might feel sexually attracted to them, but how long does it last? What does that make you think about? And those are just answers from one person. And someone else might be totally different. So to go back to the actual question that, the listener is asking, a lot of that is talking to other people who you are pretty sure are not ace, and what are they actually experiencing? And it's also, a lot of it is just reading stories of other folks. It might be listening to podcasts, or it might be, there's a lot of ace writing online. What I think is really important for a lot of people who are trying to figure out whether they're ace, two things. One is, don't get too bogged down in these definitions. I know I just went on some definitions and talked about libido and all of that, but if you try to just analyze those and break them down, you're going to get confused. Read about people telling stories of their experience and think, does it align for you? And the other thing I would say is, I think it's totally fine to think about asexuality as something that's fluid. I know people who once identified as ace and they no longer identify as ace, and that's fine. I know people who later in life identified as ace. I think there can be a lot of pressure to have this be the one true identity reality for you that locks everything. And I think it's actually kind of beautiful that it's not. People often say, I'm just looking for this one identity, whether it's an orientation or a diagnosis or, an attachment pattern, and it's going to tell me everything about myself. And I'm sad that nothing fits perfectly. But if something fits perfectly, that means that you're no longer unique. In fact, the fact that you're not the platonic version of anything, that means that you're a complicated, multifaceted, shifting person. So, apply that too when you're thinking about whether you might be ace or not.
And that applies to so many, like you said, whether it's a diagnosis or an identity or whichever label or box. We search for the things that fit us as a stepping stone or as a starter, right? Like, just to kind of understand there are other people like me. But then from there, right, don't let those boxes, don't let those labels define you, right? Like, they're there for us to define ourselves.
Exactly. And I think asexuality, its ideas, the identity, the label, the community, they're here for you as long as they're helpful for you. Ooh. And I will say that for some folks, it's not helpful for them. I know some people who, based on what I know about asexuality, they could call themselves ace if they wanted. I would never, diagnose someone as ace or not, but they choose not to use the label because it doesn't add anything to them. It's not helpful to them. They're respectful, but it's not for them. And I think that's fine too. It is not meant to be, a trap or a trick. It is not meant to scare you. It's so interesting to me that my book came out, a bunch of people started telling me maybe a year later, I was kind of afraid to read the book because I was afraid that deep down I was ace and I was going to have to face it and it was going to be trapped there. So first of all, I think the book can often shows visions of what is possible when you're ace. It's not just a sentence, but also, you can read the book and recognize a lot of your experience and not identify as ace, and that's totally fine too.
Can we rewind a little bit to what you were saying about speaking with your friends or your boyfriend or all these different people about what sexual attraction feels like for them? Can you give some examples?
For instance, people will say things like they often feel distracted by people that they find sexually attractive. And what's interesting to me is that they will talk about sexually attractive people as being distinct from aesthetically attractive. They'll say, like, this is someone that, like, they're not really conventionally attractive, or they're not what we might think of as hot, but they are sexually attractive to me. So they'll talk about, like walking down the street and being distracted by them. Or they will say, like, their body will actually feel like it's warmer, or they'll feel like people they find sexually attractive, like, actually look like almost brighter to them in their visual field, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And some of these make sense to me. Definitely people that I do find aesthetically attractive. I can notice more than people I don't find aesthetically attractive. I don't think I have a bodily reaction to people I find aesthetically attractive. I don't think I have any sexual attraction, by definition, to these folks. But yeah, these are just some kind of examples of what it feels like. They will say, like, I feel drawn to them, not just because I think they might be interesting, but it's like in a very bodily way. And some of that is just not my experience. Again, I am drawn to people. I've had crushes on people. I've had relationships. But it's always, to me, felt a little bit slant from some of these other experiences.
That makes perfect sense to me. The difference between aesthetic attraction versus sexual attraction, even for me, an allosexual person, I found that distinction confusing for many years in my attraction to men. So I thought that I was attracted to men in various ways for most of my life. It was only once I realized the difference between those things that I realized that I'm actually gay. And what I was experiencing towards men was this aesthetic attraction, this kind of finding different men pleasing to look at or nice to be around or whatever different things can pull you toward a person. The experience of sexual attraction, for me, it's very distinct from those other experiences. It's a helpful way to kind of frame the consideration of asexuality and what that experience might be like.
Absolutely. And I think there's always this fine line to walk. On the one hand, it's really important to question these differences because you can learn and see these things about yourself. On the other hand, they do connect. There often is overlap. So just don't get obsessed with, that one time, could that have been sexual attraction or aesthetic attraction, See the definitions and the boundaries, again, as they're useful. Or at least try not to fall down this rabbit hole of over-analyzing, because in the end, so many things are interconnected.
And that was such a big takeaway from your book, was that learning about asexuality can be helpful for the entire community. It can be helpful for the world as a whole, for our experience of desire as a whole, not just for people who might identify with asexuality specifically.
Yeah, recently who was I talking to? I was talking to my boyfriend, and we're talking about my book for some reason, though, just to be clear, we are not constantly talking about my book. And I don't remember what I asked him, but he made a comment that I thought was interesting, which was that, so my boyfriend happened to know a lot about ace people before meeting me. And he said that he learned some stuff about, ace people they didn't already know. But what he found interesting was that he felt like the book taught him more about allo people. And specifically, he mentioned this one chapter in which I talk about kind of this tension between asexuality and the ace philosophy. The ace philosophy being that, there's a whole range of levels of sexual attraction or sexual desire that's normal. And, some of the ways in which feminism has become this type of sexual pressure and kind of connected having sex to being feminist. And the more sex you have, the more feminist you are. So he was talking about that chapter, which is not, it's about aces, but he was saying how it made him realize that there were these pressures that could be on feminist women, whether they were ace or not. And so I actually really liked that, him saying, as an allo person, that he felt like the book taught him more about allo people than it did about ace people.
As an allo person, I found the book really thought-provoking. In many ways. It will be linked in the description. It'll be linked in the show notes for anybody who's interested in going to check it out. I really recommend it. So in terms of other misconceptions or misunderstandings about asexuality, what are some common ones?
One common one is that it means that you don't want relationships or that you don't experience romantic attraction. So, aces kind of split sexual attraction, which we talked about, and romantic attraction, which is this even more fuzzy and nebulous thing. It's kind of the feeling of wanting to date someone. And I'm not aromantic, but, a lot of people who are aromantic talk to me and they say, you people who are not aromantic, you can't explain to me what romantic attraction is, but I just accept that I don't feel it. So, kind of similar questions around that. But people tend to link these together. They think, if you're ace, then you're also aromantic, but that's not the case. There are aces who are aromantic. There are also people who are aromantic and not ace. And so related communities, but not the same. And then there's just a lot of misconceptions about what causes asexuality. I think a lot of people don't want to think about asexuality as a thing that exists. They only want to think about it as a side effect of something bad. So they want to think that it is caused by sexual trauma. It is caused by, bad attachment styles. It's caused by that one terrible girlfriend you had. It is caused by you being anxious about sex. And, once again, I will always say, our sexualities are so complicated. All of these factors can affect asexuality, stuff like your health or, your hormone levels that can affect your experience of asexuality. That still doesn't mean that asexuality doesn't exist in itself, that it's only this side effect. And the other thing is that a lot of people think being ace is the same as being celibate. But that's not, celibacy is the behavior. It's, I'm choosing not to have sex. Asexuality is kind of how you experience or don't experience sexual attraction. You can both be ace and celibate, but they're not the same.
Well, and that speaks to a misconception that you mentioned earlier, just the general misconception that asexual folks are not interested in sex as a whole or don't have sex as a whole. And you mentioned that there might be other reasons that an asexual person might want to have sex other than sexual attraction. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I will say is that I always want to emphasize there are lots of ace people who don't want to have sex, and that's not my experience, but I never want to, talk over that. In terms of, what are other reasons to have sex? Boredom, is one, to be honest. Or, it makes you feel closer to your partner. Or, maybe your partner wants to have sex and you love your partner. And, I want to be careful here again. There's a difference between I'm not, feeling lust right now, but I'm happy to have sex with my partner because I love them. And, I feel pressure to have sex with my partner and they're coercing me. There's a difference. Sometimes it makes you feel good about yourself. Sometimes sex just feels good and it's pleasurable. So there's a lot of reasons. And again, this doesn't just apply to ace people. There's a lot of reasons that allo people have sex that are not related to, just pure sexual attraction or sexual desire.
Absolutely. I want to take a second to thank the sponsor of this week's content, Surfshark. For any of you who don't know, Surfshark is a VPN service, a virtual private network that changes your computer's IP address, tricking the internet into thinking that you are anywhere in the world that you want to be. Surfshark has over 3,200 servers in 100 countries that allows you to access and unblock content from those countries. So think having every Netflix library in the entire world. Not only that, but Surfshark helps you secure your online data because a VPN encrypts your personal information. So it protects you if you're using public Wi-Fi or if you're accessing sensitive information. Surfshark also doesn't monitor, track, or store anything that you do online, meaning there are no connection or activity logs. And of course, I have a deal for you. You get an extra 4 months for free of Surfshark. Not only that, but they offer a 30-day money-back guarantee so you can try it out risk-free. It's linked in my description. But before we get to the rest of the episode, I want to take a second to thank Nancy for partnering with Sleeping Around. Nancy is in the business of pleasure products, for any of you who are not familiar. They are all too familiar with the limitations and stereotypes around adult toys and pleasure, that these toys can sometimes be intimidating or complicated or ugly. They are redefining the game and challenging the status quo. Meet the Lem. This is just one of the toys that Nancy offers, but I wanted to show it to you in this beautiful box because, oh my god, the packaging. But what I really want to talk about is their Beginner Bliss bundle, which includes the Lem, but it also includes the Uno. These are toys that are designed to not only be cute, but they're beginner friendly. For example, the Uno is a personal massage wand, but it's designed for beginners. The vibration settings start low and slow. A lot of vibrators can be really intense, not the Uno. And the Lem, not only is it cute, but it's designed for people who are curious about these suction type toys. And in the Beginner Bliss bundle, you get both. Plus, I have a discount for you all. If you use the code AlaynaJ at checkout, you can get 25% off your order. The toys are made of premium, waterproof, body-safe silicone. They're so smooth to the touch, and they're cute. This will all be linked in the description. I recommend you go check it out. Thank you to Nancy for partnering with us here on Sleeping Around. it's very easy for people to imagine an allo person having sex with someone that they're not attracted to for whatever reason, whereas they seem to have more difficulty grasping the idea of an asexual person having sex with someone that they're not sexually attracted to. And I invite people listening to apply the same imaginative scenario.
Yeah, that's totally it. I think sometimes just something about the word or maybe the presentation gets at people, and they'll say things like, what is it like to be ace? Like it's an experience that an allo person has never had. But sometimes they'll say like, most people, I assume, are not experiencing sexual attraction 24 hours a day. So just maybe think about a time you're going through the world not experiencing sexual attraction, and it's kind of like that most of the time. It's not some kind of unusual experience. And similarly, with your example, so many times, mostly when I was younger, I remember hearing a friend say, like, I didn't even like that guy. He wasn't even that good looking. Why? What was I doing? Why did I sleep with him? And that was normal. But then if an ace, the idea of an ace person having sex and enjoying it seems unnatural.
Yeah, it's like it doesn't fit in the cleanly defined box that we've, as a whole decided that this is what asexuality means. The spectrum of asexuality. So you've said that there are those folks who are sex repulsed, but then there's what would be the other side. Can you talk a little bit more about the spectrum? I'm specifically asking because I'm imagining the listener at home who's going either, I'm wondering if I am asexual, I'm wondering if I fit in this community, or someone who's not asexual who's listening and trying to understand kind of the full range of experience that's possible.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, there are a lot of people who are sex repulsed. It's not something that appeals to them. And then I think the rest of it is just people for whom maybe they don't experience sexual attraction, but they have all those other reasons, as we mentioned, to have sex and want sex and enjoy sex. And then there are people who maybe don't experience sexual attraction, but they have a high libido. They still have, that desire to have orgasms, basically. And they can still have it with people that they like, or people that they love, or people that, they can still, you don't need sexual attraction to have sex. You don't even need sexual attraction to want to have sex or like sex, is what I'm saying. So hopefully that helps. Yeah, there really is an extremely wide variety of experiences that can fit under the ACE label.
So I also got questions around, in terms of dating and relationships, I know that asexual folks, allosexual folks can have relationships. I think that's probably another misconception, that an asexual person could only date another asexual person. Can you talk a little bit about what it would look like for an ace and an allo person to be in a relationship together?
This is another example, when people ask me these questions, is that they're imagining ace-allo relationships as just fundamentally extremely different, like in a categorically different from allo relationships. And I don't think that's true, because a lot of what I would say to you about how do we navigate this relationship can go for any two people in a relationship, because it is, I don't think there's, at least I don't know of any relationships in which the level of sexual desire, libido, whatever, attraction is always exactly the same. There's almost always a higher desire partner and a lower desire partner, and they have to work together and see what works for them. And sometimes you can have two people who are both allosexual and they can't make it work either because of sex discrepancies or, differences in desire. So a lot of it is about, being really open about communication, being really open about what does sex mean for you? How does that, how might that look? What role is sex playing? Like, what are these things that we can negotiate? But specifically for aces, I do think there's a couple things that are worth pointing out. One is that, especially for folks who, might not realize they're ace or kind of haven't come into contact with ideas about being ace, there's often a lot of shame around being the lower desire partner. And there's often this idea that they're the one who's broken. The higher desire partner is the normal one, and it's their job by themselves to fix themselves with toys or drugs or whatnot. And so I think it's important to emphasize. And again, this goes for anyone of any orientation, but I think ace people are especially vulnerable. It's important to emphasize that the problem is the mismatch.
Yes.
The problem isn't that something's wrong with you. The problem is that what you want and what they want is not aligned, which can happen with any two people. So it's not a moral failing to be the way that you are. And it's hard to feel that because like there's so much shame and so much, frankly, marketing directed toward making your libido higher. And the other thing I would say is that I think that especially in relationships, if you aren't familiar with the concept of asexuality, or even if you aren't familiar with this idea that, no matter your gender orientation or whatnot, this is our body and we are allowed to say no for any reason, then it can be easy for people to just blame the other person. Like, I'm kind of talking from the other side now, where you can imagine being the higher desire partner. And if you don't know about asexuality at all, and you think that everybody always experiences sexual attraction, and your partner isn't experiencing sexual attraction to you, doesn't want to have sex, and there's no kind of, obvious reason, then it can be easy for the higher desire partner to think, oh, they're just trying to punish me, they're playing games, blah, blah, blah. What if this is just how they are? What if this is not because you're not a good partner for them? What if this is not about you not being good in bed? What if this is not something about you personally? So I've seen that from the other side too, in which I think for a lot of people, having sex or making their partner feel good or pleasing them in bed is connected to their own ego. And so if you have a partner who's lower desire, it feels sometimes like a rejection of you when it's about them. So, again, all of these are for people, all kinds of relationships, but these ideas, I think, are particularly helpful for people who are ace or maybe on the lower desire side, because if you don't hear them, then it's easy to kind of violate your own boundaries. When you're always told you should have this much sex, you owe sex, you need to do this, then you start believing it and crossing your own lines.
If you don't want to have sex with your partner, there's something wrong with you, and if your partner doesn't want to have sex with you, there's something wrong with you. There's so much pressure and expectation around what sex in a relationship is supposed to look like. Absolutely. Do you have any specific advice or practical tips that you would offer to both the ace partner in the relationship, and I got a specific question about being the allo partner in a relationship and how to best support an asexual partner, or how to best be a good partner for a person who identifies as asexual?
I think neither person in the partnership should be ashamed of what they want. I think ace people can be ashamed of not wanting to have sex. And I also feel like allo people can be ashamed of wanting to have sex and feeling like they're, asking too much from their partner, and I don't think a relationship is healthy when both people are ashamed and they feel bad about what their desire is, and so then they get resentful. So I think for both, it's like, own what you want and try to see the space in which there might be overlap. Don't erase yourself, is what I'm saying to both partners. Don't erase yourself. Don't erase your need, whichever direction there might be. Hold space for yourself and also look at the partner. So I know that's a much more vague tip than like schedule check-ins once a month, which which I'm also in favor of. But I think it's important because one thing that can often happen when you're first learning about ideas around asexuality or anything else is that you think, oh, I've been wrong this whole time. What else am I wrong about? And that shame, whichever direction it is, can be corrosive. But other than that, I think a lot of it is being really patient and also questioning, if you are, the allo partner and the higher desire partner, like really trying to question and break down what your needs might be. For many people, sex is, kind of heterosexual, penetrative sex. What else might there be that kind of fulfills your various needs, whether they're physical or emotional or communicative? So I think really approaching things with this sense of openness about what sex is, about what intimacy is, about what your needs are, how your needs can change, how your needs might not change. I think that is really important.
I love you've almost flipped the question from like, how can I support my asexual partner, to a more self-reflective place of like, well, the best way that you can support is to understand, what does sex mean to you? What is it that you want versus what is it that you need? And then opening that conversation and having a open communication between two partners. That is helpful advice for any partnership.
Exactly. Because you want to understand what sex is to them, what they want, what they need. But if you don't know the answers to yourself, then the understanding will always be lopsided. So I think both partners should be asking that for themselves, and both partners should be curious about the other person's experience and just, having a lot of those discussions.
And would you apply that same advice to somebody who is identified as asexual and looking to enter the dating world?
I think so. I think dating, if you're ace, is tricky for a lot of reasons. And one is because, as we've talked about, the ace label in some ways doesn't provide that much information.
Right.
A lot of people will see ace and they will think, you're sex repulsed, and sometimes that might not be correct, but to me, it's a little bit frustrating because if someone tells you they're ace, you actually have no idea with just that word what their experience may be. You'd have no idea what their sexual behavior might be like or what your theoretical sex life could be like. And it can be hard to figure out how to disclose that information. And I think, for someone who's identifying as ace and moving into the world, the emphasis should be on, communicating. I mean, first of all, your own comfort is important, but, communicating what is relevant for the other person to know. It's like informed consent, right? You want them to have informed consent to date you. You want to have informed consent to date them. So oftentimes, when it comes to dating, if people want to identify as ace and come out with the word, I think that's great. I also say don't feel guilty if you want to save that, conversation for, an open conversation once they've built up trust, once you are able to actually explain your experience, not what they might mistakenly think is the ace experience.
Right, the assumptions that they might make around the word. So what would be an example of something when you say information that's relevant? What's the information that's relevant to the other person? If you're not wanting to come out and use the word asexual, what kind of information would you consider relevant?
Yeah, so I think that if, for example, like this is a fairly clear-cut one, like if you are sex repulsed and celibate, I think that is relevant. Or other things might be like, you don't necessarily have to say, I'm ace, and this is what I feel, and this is what asexuality is, when it's like, my relationship to sex is this. It's more like showing them like a container, like here are the boundaries, here are the hard things that I am not comfortable with and, to my understanding right now will not do. Here's places where there might be room for more flexibility and room for change. It's not like giving them a business card or giving them a word. It's like, here's kind of a shape of what they might be. Some people who are ace do not like being cuddled. Other people like being cuddled. They like various types of, what we might call sexual activity, but there's other types that are, not okay with and may never be okay with. And that's the kind of information, like stuff that's relevant to them and helping them make a decision about where their flexibility is.
And the phrasing of framing the conversation around kind of taking it back to needs and boundaries and wants, that could feel more approachable, I imagine, to someone versus needing to come out with this label and then explanation and addressing all of the assumptions.
I think it can sometimes feel more approachable. Sometimes it's just hard no matter who you're talking to. I do feel from talking to a lot of aces that there is this certain baggage when saying you're ace because there's such a large spectrum. So many people say, okay, I'm ace and I'm this way. But just so you know, not all aces are like this. And some are like, and that's...
The disclaimers.
Yeah, all the disclaimers and stuff, and it gets confusing. So at least, if you stick to your experience, you don't have to get to the disclaimers yet. Though hopefully later you do, and when you start talking maybe more explicitly about sexuality.
So changing the direction a little bit, I see conversation about asexuality in the queer community, and some arguments that asexuality shouldn't be included in the community, or why are we putting an A in the LGBTQIA plus. So I'd like to know, as a queer community, as a queer person, how can we better support asexual folks in a time when it feels like sometimes there's this kind of gatekeeping, exclusionary conversation going on?
On a kind of a structural institutional level, a lot of it is about learning about ace experience. So I think it's actually, from what I've heard, not uncommon for people to, for example, aces to go to their campus's LGBT organization or their queer center and then not have anything about asexuality there. And I think that's especially frustrating to be in a place that's supposed to have something for you, and you're the one giving the TED talk, you're the one doing all the disclaimers. So some of it is that. I also think that some of the arguments I hear about, are aces queer is that, well, they can pass, you don't necessarily have to know that people are ace. I mean, first of all, that's not true, because there's a lot of homoromantic aces. So there's many, many intersections of asexuality with many other things. But another thing is that I would hope that for the queer community at large, it is a community that is based more on trying to fight for your slice of the pie. Aceness and ace thought questions compulsory sexuality. It questions compulsory heterosexuality. It questions a lot of things, and I think that aces have so much to bring to the queer community. And so I hope that other members of the queer community see that I don't think aces are trying to take things away. But even more than that, I don't think it's helpful to think of it as there's just this one thing that and it's limited and it's a zero-sum game. But yeah, a lot of it is about trying to change. There are differences in the ace experience and in the ace struggles from folks who might be trans or lesbian or so on, but not everything has to be the same to kind of work together and be part of this community.
100%. So I'm hearing that as a queer woman, as a lesbian woman, within the queer community at the moment, I'm in the majority, or I'm in the group that maybe has more power. And so it's my job, it's my responsibility to stand up, to educate. We want people who identify on all areas of the spectrum to be able to come to queer spaces or a queer podcast or whatever it is and feel represented and feel included. And so it's our job to make sure that there is ace representation and that it doesn't just fall on your shoulders, to make space for yourself, right?
Yeah. Another thing I would say is that I think that when you work to make spaces more ace inclusive, including conversations, that can help everyone. So one thing that I think about is, I think sometimes people have the stereotype of aces as they don't want us talking about sex at all. They don't want us talking about pleasure. They want us to shut up about it. And I don't think that's the case for most aces I know. I do think that, there's nothing wrong with talking about pleasure and how good sex can be pleasurable without saying, if you don't have good sex, then there's something wrong with you. If you don't want sex, then you're not human. If you change those patterns of, it's not about doing something less. It's about acknowledging that viewpoint is just not the only one. And I also think that if you do that, then aces are not the only people being helped. There might not be aces, someone might not be ace, but they might be lesbian and have a low libido, and they might feel alienated by, conversations that aren't ace inclusive. So yeah, once again, I keep bringing up this theme that it's not there's aces and then there's allos and never, it's what they famously say about disability accommodations, right? They help people who are not disabled too. If you need a stroller, it's much easier to go up a ramp than it is to go up, a curb. And in the same way, how, thinking differently, it helps many people in the community, and it can help you, because even if you're allo, throughout your life, your own sexuality is just going to change. And if you have this idea of your sexuality has to be one way and it means this one thing, then when it changes, when you go through periods when you feel differently, you'll feel shame too. And I don't want anyone feeling shame about themselves.
I love that that's kind of the through line of this episode, that these conversations and this way of thinking and understanding this experience can be helpful for all sorts of different folks, all sorts of different identities. I think it's so true and it's so important. So last question that I have for you before we go into the Patreon exclusive extended version where we answer some audience questions. This show is all about bringing insights, therapeutic insights, academic insights to our listeners. So in your work with asexuality, what is one thing that you wish everybody knew?
Can I say one thing I wish everyone knew and then one thing that I wish everyone did?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we've kind of touched on both. And the first one is, there's so much, but deep down, it has to be that there are all kinds of levels of sexual attraction and libido and all of this. and all of them can be fine, and you can choose and decide and accept yourself. I mean, notice that I didn't even say the word like asexuality and, ace identity there. Like, I think the key idea, like if we had that belief, it would do so much regardless of whether you can memorize the definitions of asexuality. So that's kind of, the one thing I wish everyone understood. And the one thing I wish everyone did, we also touched about, is, talk to people in your life, be curious about, as long as it's comfortable and safe, what their actual sexuality feels like. Not just that person is hot, but like, what is it like? What does sexual attraction feel like to you? Why do you have sex? Like, ask people these questions, think about it for themselves, because we are being tricked by vague language. We are being held back from understanding by kind of these brush off conversations.
And I would take that a step further and say we're being tricked by representation in the media. We're being tricked by what sexuality and what relationship, what sex is supposed to look like, what it looks like all the time. Thank you for that. Thank you for being here. Is there anything else that you want to share or touch on that we haven't covered?
Not necessarily, except just to say that I think that asexuality, as with so many topics from people's experiences, is always changing. When I was writing the book, one of the things I kept thinking was, I hope this book won't be outdated in 5 years. And I don't think it is, but I've kind of started thinking maybe it'd be good if it were outdated, because that means like we're moving forward in our understanding. We're always refining. And, so I think that's partly a disclaimer. If you're listening to this in 5 years and you think what I'm saying sounds totally outdated, I'm ahead of you. It's partly that. But it's partly like genuinely, everything is changing and shifting, and I'm learning new things always. And I think that's great.
Definitely. If any of you want to learn more, if you want more of this conversation, the book Ace will be linked in the description. I really recommend checking it out. It's a great read, no matter where you fall on the sexuality spectrum. Thank you for your time. We're going to hop over into the extended version now. But for the regular listeners, where can people find you?
Right now, I'm one of those people who's honestly constantly kind of activating, deactivating the social media accounts. The inner struggle is real. So the best way is just my website, angelachen.org. And, I have stuff about the book there and work. So that I am confident will hopefully always be up, whereas on any given day, my Instagram might have disappeared.
Right. Okay, so we'll put the link to your website in the show notes and in the description. Thanks for listening. You can also access all of our extended cut episodes with bonus content from every single guest over on Patreon at patreon.com/AlaynaJoy. That's patreon.com/ALAYNAJoy. And be sure to follow us on Instagram at SleepingAroundPod for updates, teasers, episode discussions, and more. Another thank you to Nancy for partnering with us on this video. Remember, you can use the code AlaynaJ to get 25% off your order at checkout. And I would personally recommend checking out the Beginner Bliss Bundle if you're curious about exploring some different sensations. And remember that you can get an extra 4 months of Surfshark for free. It's linked in the description. This episode was produced by Alayna Joy and Danae Fender and edited by Lucian Brinkley. See you next time, back here on the couch.